Hello and welcome back to my shop. Here I have a file that I previously annealed. It's ready to make a knife out of. So I'm designing a field knife that I want to make this into. The knife is going to have a saber grind and it's going to have removable micarta scales, which will be really cool. So stick around and let's make this knife. I've seen people on YouTube use spray paint to outline the knife design. But it didn't really work here. The paint just bled under the teeth of the file. You can see this is an arcade antique file made in the USA, a mill bastard file, and the teeth on it were really dull and worn out, so that's why I'm making it into a knife here. I use my 2x72 belt grinder with a 36 grit belt, and it makes quick work of profiling out this knife. And now I'm going to grind the flats of the knife to get rid of the sharp teeth of the file. Even though they were worn out, they're still too sharp to leave on the knife. And the best thing for that is to stick it to a big magnet. Otherwise the steel gets really hot and you can't hold on to it. But the magnet gives you something big that you can grip onto without burning your hands or getting too close to the belt. So I just flatten off those teeth, but I still want to leave the design of the teeth in there. And then use some masking tape on the side that you already ground so that the magnet doesn't put any deep scratches in it. And then you can hold on to that and do the other side. So I just find the center line of the handle here, and I'm marking out where I'm going to drill for the pinholes. And I always make sure to center punch before I drill into any steel. I then decided to drill a bunch of extra holes to lighten up the knife. And then I wanted to try and mill out a little section here to make it even lighter with a carbide bit on my Dremel tool. In order to make sure I grind my bevels evenly, I'm marking a center line down the blade. And I just used the correct size drill bit to match the thickness of the blade, and the point was perfectly centered. The way I like to grind bevels is I tilt my platen to the correct angle, and then I clamp up my blade in a couple of pieces of angle iron that holds it at 90 degrees. And then I lubricate my tool rest here so that it slides freely as I'm grinding back and forth. And then you can see with the platen angled there and the knife held at 90 degrees, it just gives me the perfect angle to grind in those bevels. And then it's just a lot of back and forth on each side till you slowly bring your bevels into the center line. This method also really works good for grinding in the false edge or the swedge, as some people call it. I like to add a sharpening choil, and that just helps you to sharpen the full length of your edge. And I'm just using a carbide bit there with my Dremel tool. Before I harden the knife, I use a chunk of steel to preheat the oil. And then I get the knife in the forge, heat it up to non-magnetic, and quench it in that oil. Then test with a file to make sure it was hardened, and if the file skates across the edge and doesn't bite in, then you know you achieved full hardness. And then it goes in the oven for a couple of cycles of tempering. And this helps the steel to be tough and not as brittle. I picked up a bit of a warp during the heat treatment. So in order to get rid of that warp, I use a carbide tipped ball peen hammer. And you hammer on the side that is curled up, and it seems like maybe the opposite of what you would want to do. But by hammering on the side that has the curve on it, you lengthen the surface area on that side and it actually flattens out the blade. And luckily I'm able to just do this on the handle portion here so that it doesn't mess up any of that cool texture of the file that I want to leave. Just marking off my handle here in some micarta that I want to use for the handle scales. Cutting it out on my bandsaw. I like to use masking tape between everything and then just put a couple of dabs of super glue on there to hold everything together while I drill out the handles to receive the pins. And I think this is just the easiest method, and if you use the masking tape, it just makes it so there's no cleanup with the super glue. You first drill through one side, and then when you're finished with that, put a couple more dabs of super glue, get your other side on there, and then you can drill straight through everything. And then you know everything is perfectly lined up, the glue held everything in place where it needs to be, and you don't have to mess around with any extra pins, or some people like to stick drill bits of the correct size in there to make sure everything lines up, but I just find this to be the easiest method. And then you can see it just comes apart super easy, and you peel that tape and you have no mess to clean up. And then I'm just using some temporary brass pins here. So then I scribe the handle shape onto the micarta so that I can take it over the grinder and grind it as close to the profile as possible. And then I make sure to mark out where I want the front of the handle to be and draw that in with a Sharpie so I know where to grind to. And then just take it over to the belt grinder and grind it as close to the profile as I can get. I always use this jig to put this bevel on the front of my handle scales. It works really well. And you want to do this before your handles are attached to your knife, otherwise you can't get in there and do it properly. It's not such a big deal on these handles because these are meant to be removable. And this is how I make the hardware for the removable handles. I get this aluminum tube from the hardware store, and it just happens to be the right size to tap out for a 10 by 32 screw. So you can use a hacksaw or an angle grinder and cut off some pieces that are just the right size to fit within your handle scales and through your knife tang. But you don't want them the same exact length as your full thickness of your handle scales and your knife tang. You want to leave room for a screw head to be recessed under the handle scales. And you can just mess around till you figure out the right thickness for that. And then these are some 10 by 32 hex head button round screws. I think they're 1/4 of an inch long, give or take. I just get those at the hardware store as well. And I take these little sections of the aluminum tube that I cut and get the correct thread. This is a 10 by 32 that will match these screws, and get the correct thread tap. Use some oil here to help it cut, and just tap that out so that it can accept that screw. And I'm doing a test fit here, and it fit really well. So then I get a larger drill bit that is just slightly bigger than the head of the screw, and I'm going to use it to countersink where I drilled out the handles. And this is so that the screw can fit flush or just under the surface of the handles. And I actually just use a stop on my drill press. It has a built-in stop, and I just measured the correct depth for those screw heads, and then it stopped perfectly. Then we can do a test fit here with the handle before I do any further shaping on it. And so here I'm just using a little brass rod to tap that aluminum coupler to be centered in the middle of the handles and the knife blade. Then I can put the screws on either side of the handles. And then with everything fit up, it still needs a little more profiling on the handle scales to be perfectly flush. So I take it over to the belt grinder and just use a fine grit belt and slowly grind till I bring it down flush with the handle. By far the easiest way to shape a knife handle is to use a round over bit on a router. And here I have a little router table that I clamp to my workbench, and this works to just quickly radius all the edges of the knife handle. Now you won't have a super contoured knife handle if you use this method, but I like it for certain knife styles, and I think it works well for this type of a knife. In order to aid with retention in a kydex sheath, I mill this little groove up towards the front of the handle scales. I do this on both handle scales. And I just use the correct little bit that will put a little perfect groove in there for me. So that gives the kydex something to click into when you're ready to make your kydex sheath. And then I can take those handle scales off and just do my final profiling on the bevels. And I'm using a finer grit belt here, and I'm just going slow and making sure to keep the knife cool since it's already been hardened. And I don't want to ruin the hardness of the blade by overheating it. Once I've finished grinding my bevels, I use the belt grinder to put the final edge on the knife. And off camera I made sure to strop the blade to remove any burr. So now we're ready for final assembly. I think the knife came out really nice. That file got really hard and took a really good edge, and it's slicing through this paper really nicely. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you for your time. I hope you were entertained and that you learned something, and I'll see you on the next one.